Alrighty, welcome to the second of our pre-recorded lectures and the last lecture of the course. So we're going to be looking at Act 5 of Hamlet today, as well as wrapping up some of the major themes that we've considered over the course of this semester. Um, but to begin, we are going to start with a prayer, as we usually do. So feel free to pray along. I'm going to share the screen here. We're going to end with a prayer to Our Lady, the words of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the Gospel of Luke, known as the Magnificat. All right. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on his lowly servant. From this day, all generations will call me blessed. The Almighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. He has mercy on those who fear him in every generation. He has shown the strength of his arm. He has scattered the proud in their conceit. He has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has come to the help of his servant Israel, for he has remembered his promise of mercy, the promise he made to our fathers, to Abraham and his children forever. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. All right, so let's jump back in. Last time we went over Acts 3 and Acts 4 of Hamlet. Um, where we last left our heroes and villains, they were preparing for a couple things. The return of Hamlet, who had been sent away to England with the idea from King Claudius that he would get rid of Hamlet by murdering him by proxy, sending him with a letter that says kill Hamlet. But now he's on his way back, and uh, Laertes, the son of the murdered Polonius, who was killed at the hand of Hamlet in Gertrude's bedchamber, Laertes is back as well, vowing revenge for the death of his father, similarly to how Hamlet was vowing revenge for the death of his, but this time with much more immediacy and gusto than Hamlet, who has delayed and delayed and delayed his revenge. But Laertes is back, and he then conspires with the King Claudius to make sure that Hamlet will die in this duel, whether it be because Laertes nicks him with the poison tip of the spear, or because if he wins the duel, the king will give him a poisoned cup of wine. That's kind of where we're at here at the beginning of Act 5. But we open with a very different kind of scene than we've seen before. So let's see if we can get that up here. All right. Hamlet, Act 5. Act 5, Scene 1. Yorick's Skull. Hamlet, returned from his journey, comes upon a gravedigger singing as he digs. Hamlet tries to find out who the gravedigger is for and reflects on the skulls that are being dug up. A funeral procession approaches. Hamlet soon realizes that the corpse is Ophelia's. When Laertes, in his grief, leaps into her grave and curses Hamlet as the cause of Ophelia's death, Hamlet then comes forward. He and Laertes struggle, with Hamlet protesting his own love and grief for Ophelia. All right, so page 239, Act 5, Scene 1. We have these other characters. Now, Hamlet is a play with many, many, many characters and many, many ranges of characters. In Richard II, we had mostly the nobility and those who were the flatterers of the nobility in the court, except for that one scene with the gardener and the queen. But in Hamlet, we have quite a range and the interesting cast of characters from the prince to the king to the queen, to similarly nobles within the court, but also gestures and go-betweens. Well, let's just look at this. The point is, we have this whole build up with these big themes that we're thinking about, very serious, dramatic themes of the uncertainties in life and death, and questions surrounding the state of being dead, right? Not just dying, but Hamlet is a play about the state of being dead. What happens after that death? Now we get a kind of comic interlude right at the culmination of a lot of things here. The gravedigger and the other man are speaking to each other in a kind of ridiculous fashion, kind of putting on, like, almost putting on airs to pretend to be more sophisticated in their consideration of the things that they're talking about. So, um, the other disconnect is that they're talking about a woman who has died, and yet they're talking at such a casual register that it's meant to be kind of comical, the light touch at which they take this topic with. Um, but they start with a kind of a debate. Is she to be buried in Christian burial when she willfully seeks her own salvation? I tell thee she is, therefore make her grave straight. The crowner hath sat on her and finds it Christian burial. The question here that they're going over is whether or not um, she can be buried in a Christian graveyard with the Christian funeral rites, because at that time, those who it was understood to have committed suicide were to be refused Christian burial. Under the same kind of logic that we've talked about when we spoke about the ring of the suicides in Inferno, the kind of final act of despair that separates one from his own life and body and degrades the dignity of the human person, in that way, was thought of in the Middle Ages as well as in the Renaissance as a kind of self proclamation of a separation from the Christian people. Now, of course, as we mentioned when speaking about that ring, modern Catholic and Christian understanding of suicide really incorporates new understandings of the psychological state of the person and questions whether or not somebody could make a willing, fully informed decision if they've reached that kind of state of depression. But we're going to put that aside only because what the gravedigger and the other person are talking about, um, really kind of descends into a ridiculous. The grave digger says it must be se offendo, which your notes says on the other page in self offense, not self defense. The grave digger's rendering of the common legal phrase se defendo in self defense. So he's kind of like switching up some legal jargon. It cannot be else, for here lies the point. If I drown myself wittingly, it argues an act, and an act hath three branches. It is to act, to do, to perform. Argyle, she drowned herself wittingly. And they're kind of debating using a pretension to high register legal jargon, scholastic terminology, but they're really kind of missing the point either way. So it's meant to be a kind of um, poke at when people use jargon language. Here they're kind of putting on that pretense. If a man go to his water and drown himself, it is will he nil he goes, mark you that. This is an example of the ridiculous. But if a man goes to the water, but if the water come to him and drown him, he drowns not himself, right? They're kind of like going through this method of reasoning, but they're imagining like water coming to somebody and drowning that person. It's quite ridiculous. And it does, in fact, it does also around line 25 when they settle, yes, Christian burial. it comes to another point here that's a kind of class critique point. Um, the other person said, if this had not been a gentlewoman, if she had not been of a kind of noble class, she would have been buried outside of a Christian burial. So he's saying, like, all right, you know, she she was drowned. There's some question as to whether or not it was intentional or it was an accident, whether her madness excuses that intentional act under our understanding of what qualifies as a Christian or not Christian burial. Here, the other person is saying, if she was just a common woman, they wouldn't have even considered giving her a Christian burial. And the gravedigger kind of turns that reality and says, why, there thou sayest. And the more pity that great folk should have countenance in this world to drown or hang themselves more than they're even Christian. Come, my spade, there is no ancient gentleman but gardeners, ditchers, and grave makers. They hold up Adam's profession. The gravedigger here is basically saying that, sure, I admit the rich will receive Christian burial and their questionable acts of potential suicide may be excused because they're rich. But is it really all that a pity that we're giving more cause or reason or countenance for the rich to kill themselves? The gravedigger is kind of saying that, sure, they have this privilege of being afforded Christian burial, but really, is it any much privilege to be said, to be told, or to be given some incentive to kill yourself? Yeah. Um, it's all meant to be kind of funny here. And when Hamlet returns, there's a kind of mix between the comical and the serious. So let's get to some of those lines because the gravedigger and the other go on for some time. But the gravedigger is, let's see, on page 247. Which is around line 135. We have this back and forth questioning. Again, questions throughout this play are a major theme, how they're asked, why they're asked, and how they're responded to. In this case, Hamlet is trying to wring out the truth from this person who's just a slippery fish and will not answer any question straightforwardly. Um, Hamlet is trying to ask essentially just, who is this grave for? Since you're sort of really casually throwing out skulls that have been buried here in the past and trying to, make a new grave. Hamlet then says, around line 30, thou dost lie in it. Oh, sorry. This begins with, whose grave is this? And the gravedigger says, oh, well, it's mine, because he's digging it, but that's obviously not what Hamlet means by that. He says, I think you lie. So Hamlet clarifies around line 130, what man dost thou dig it for? Right? That's what I was asking you in the first place. The gravedigger says, for no man, sir. He says that because, well, Hamlet means, what person are you digging this for? The gravedigger interprets that question intentionally obtusely to be narrowly asking whether or not this is a grave for a man or a woman. And since it's for Ophelia, he says, for no man, sir. So then Hamlet rolls his eyes and says, okay, what woman then? And the gravedigger says, for none, neither. Hamlet throws up his arms again. Who is to be buried in it? One that was a woman, sir, but rest her soul, she's dead. And so the gravedigger again is intentionally sort of just splitting hairs here. You can imagine him as a kind of, well, again, it sort of depends on how this person is being played, but I imagine him as a kind of cheeky person who so close to such serious matters all the time has to kind of alleviate those considerations of serious matters by a constant uh, uh, comedy, kind of a constant unseriousness. But this back and forth, I think, speaks to a lot of the kinds of questions that are being asked in this play, because it's all about asking the right question. Here, Hamlet has to clarify and clarify and clarify and still can't get the information, the matter that he's out to search for. But throughout the play, there are many instances where people ask questions and either don't get quite the answer they're looking for because they haven't posed the question in the right way or to the right person, or just the nature of their questioning is such that they can't really get at a solid, stable truth, right? I mean, we're always going to return back to the most famous monologue in the English language: to be or not to be. That is the question. And so Hamlet has identified in his mind already what it means to really ask a question, which is not, or you'll recall, whether to live or commit suicide, right? That's not really what the to be or not to be speech is about. The to be or not to be speech, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or by taking arms against the sea of trouble. I've butchered the quote, but to or to take arms against the sea of trouble and by opposing end them, right? It's a question of patient suffering understood as inaction, and a decisive action taken, um, that ironically will lead to death, right? That the action of living and choosing to make decisions towards whatever end you're purpose to, in Hamlet's mind, is what actually leads to death. And to do nothing is to sort of hold on to life and yet not live. And so the to be or not to be speech goes on, of course, about what happens when one chooses that action and then choose and by extension chooses to die by the risks and the consequences of those actions. Well, Hamlet contemplates the other major theme, which is the state of being dead, right? To die, to sleep no more, to sleep perchance to dream. What dreams may come, we do not know. All of us will one day die, but none of us definitively, apart from the professions of faith, but none of us by experience knows what it means to be dead and what happens after death, except for Dante. Okay, so Hamlet in this scene again contemplates the state of being dead, but does so in a very different manner. So, like I said, the gravedigger is sort of throwing skulls out the grave, and Hamlet now on page 249 learns the identity of one of the skulls that the gravedigger pulls out, right? Whose skull was it? Or some mad fellow it was. Whose do you think it was? Nay, I know not. A pestilence on him for a mad rogue. He poured a flagon of Rhenish on my head once. This same skull, sir, was, sir, Yorick's skull, the king's gesture. Hamlet goes on to say, Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of mine, of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises as it here hung those lips that I have kissed I know not how oft. Where are your jibes now? Where your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning? Quite chapfallen? Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her, let her. Well, then it goes on. Okay. The point being, um, this is also that very. I mean, you see it. This is everything. Hamlet is one of Shakespeare's most well-known plays, of course. And so that image of an actor holding a skull is this scene right here. Hamlet holding York's skull and contemplating what it means that the man he knew, who was this funny, lively, raucous person, is now reduced to a lifeless skull. Hamlet almost can't imagine. I mean, it's somebody who must have been out of his memory for some time, though someone he knew as a child as the Prince of Denmark, now seeing the reality of um, the significance of the passage of time and seeing the state that this person is in makes him think what is, in fact, the material reality of the state of being dead. The material reality of the state of being dead is that from dust you came, to dust you shall return. There is this on page 251, then, contemplation as he puts down the skull of asking not just the lowly jester, but it has this fate. It's not just the lowly jester that has this fate, but it's actually every man, however small or great. And he asks, um, uh, to what base uses we may return, Horatio. We return to dust. Why may not imagination trace the noble dust, very ironic, the noble dust of Alexander the Great, till he find it stopping a bunghole, that is the little cork hole of a barrel of wine, right? That cork's made of a kind of you know, dust or sediment or wood. He's saying this dust essentially becomes material stuff again, and why could it not be a cork? Um, twere to consider too curiously, to consider so. Right, Horatius? I mean, we shouldn't think about that. Hamlet, no, faith, not a jot, but to follow him thither, with modesty enough and likelihood to lead it, as thus Alexander died, Alexander was buried, Alexander returneth to dust, the dust is earth, of earth we made loam, and why of that loam whereto he was converted might not stop a beer barrel. He takes you through the steps of how Alexander the Great can become a cork in a beer barrel. Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that earth which kept the world in awe should patch a wall to expel the winter's flaw. And this again is another contemplation of the state of being dead. It's on the material reality, the material plane of it. But it provokes a real kind of deep crisis of what everyone's future holds. Everyone, again, he's referencing very common Christian liturgical phrases like "from dust you came, to dust you shall return," something that Catholics reflect upon annually during Ash Wednesday, to begin the season of Lent. But to really meditate on that, to really hold the skull of someone you knew, who was alive and joyous, and then to really think about the state of becoming dust, is something quite profound, something quite moving, something that quite disturbing, something that requires a consideration. Um, Good. Okay. That's on the material level, that Hamlet is thinking about the state of being dead. Okay, so what happens from here? A lot, a lot. But we're going to kind of go through just some of the highlights here. So we mentioned that Laertes comes back, and they have this scuffle over the love of Ophelia, whose grief is stronger, the brother's grief, or the boyfriend, the lover's grief. I feel bad. We can't cover everything, and I don't feel like I've given Ophelia as much due as she deserves. But that's just c'est la vie. Okay. Act 5, Scene 2. Then we're gonna get into this. It's a really long act, as you can tell by this description. I'm gonna read the whole description, take us to the end of the play, and then really actually only focus on a couple of the main parts here. But Act 5, Scene 2, The Fall of a Sparrow. It's another one of the important lines here we'll look at. In the hall of the castle, Hamlet tells Horatio how he discovered the king's plot against him and how he turned the tables on Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Osric enters to ask, on Claudius's behalf, that Hamlet fence with Laertes. Hamlet agrees to the contest despite his misgivings. Hamlet is winning the match. That later, Hamlet is winning the match when Gertrude drinks from the poisoned cup that Claudius had prepared for Hamlet. Laertes then wounds Hamlet with a poisoned rapier. In the scuffle that follows, Hamlet forces an exchange of rapiers and Hamlet wounds Laertes. As Gertrude dies, Laertes, himself dying, discloses his and Claudius's plot against Hamlet. Hamlet kills Claudius, and before Hamlet dies, he asks Horatio to tell the full story that has led to these deaths and gives Fortinbras, now come into the scene from Norway. You always got to remember Fortinbras, his support for the kingship. After Hamlet's death, Fortinbras arrives, claims the crown, and orders a military funeral for Hamlet. That's how the play ends. But let's look just at 2 lines here. I think that's all we'll really look at. There's quite a lot here. But the first is on page 271. Okay. Enter a lord. The lord he sends to know if your pleasure holds to play with Laertes or that you will take longer time. Right. The lord is basically, Lord is asking, are you ready to fight Laertes or that you will take longer time? Or are you going to delay? Right. Again, this is sort of the MO for Hamlet is that he delays. And so this lord who's helping prepare this duel just comes in and says, are you going to delay any longer? Essentially. Are you going to delay? Which is what Hamlet has been asking himself throughout this play. And where do we want to see? Horatio says, "You will lose, my lord. You're not going to win this." And he says, "I do not think so. Since he went into France, I have been in continual practice. I shall win at the odds, but thou wouldst not think how ill all's here about my heart. But it is no matter." Okay, so what he's saying, you wouldst not think how ill all's here about my heart. He's saying, look, I mean, I have the confidence to win, I have the skills to win, but I'm really, but I'm anxious. I'm troubled in my heart. Okay, but it is no matter. That's that word again. It is no significance. It is no feeling. It is no reality. Whether or not you take that as any of those 3 possibilities for the word matter is a different sort of resonance on which this line and the many lines that use the word "what's the matter" could be. But he says, I'm skilled enough to win the fight, but my heart is troubled, and that's no matter. It's no significance, or it's no real reality, or it's no true feeling dependent. Nay, good my lord. And then he goes on, it is but foolery, but it is such a kind of gainsgiving as would perhaps trouble a woman. If your mind dislike anything, obey it. I will forestall their repair hither and say you are not fit. Right? He's like, we can delay this. Right? Again, this is the to be or not to be speech. Right? We can delay. We can sort of suffer the wrongs of outrageous fortune for a little bit while longer, or you can act, and in so acting, die. right? These are the options here. And Horatio's like, we can forestall a little bit longer. You can be alive a little bit longer, is essentially what he's saying, because Horatio thinks Hamlet's going to lose. And Hamlet knows the plot against him. So he knows that, yeah. Well, sorry, no, Hamlet doesn't know about the poison plot. Hamlet knows that the king had conspired to kill him, and so is aware that those to whom he's about to go want him dead. And yeah, but here is a really important moment in the whole play. We've thought about how this play is a play about the state of being dead, and it's a play about questions and the unknown. And this, a lot of people identify this as an important moment in the play. C.S. Lewis has a particularly influential essay on Hamlet called Hamlet, the Prince or the Poem, in which he makes this argument that the play is about the state of being dead. And then Lewis suggests that Hamlet actually, at different points in the play, has lost his mind, has kind of gone mad, which is what many of the characters believe. It's what Hamlet wants the characters believe for his purposes. But it's what he's kind of troubled throughout the play about, is how his own thinking is operating and whether or not he actually has gone mad in the way that Ophelia has, if he's lost his mind according to the circumstances. But we've talked about all these there are several different views of death and what one's stance regarding dying and the state of being dead should be or is. But Hamlet says this in what C.S. Lewis calls this kind of moment of clarity, where he regains his sanity at this moment, whether or not he's lost it. But Lewis is saying he's regained his sanity. We can forestall, says Horatio, and Hamlet says, not a whit. We defy augury. Augury, to understand what this means, is that practice of divining the future via signs from birds, right? This is an ancient pagan practice, but it's kind of like looking for the signs in the sky and seeing birds and trying to predict the future, essentially, right? We defy augury. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. And in this case, so Hamlet is quoting from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, are not two sparrows sold for a farthing, and yet one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. Fear not, therefore ye are of more value than many sparrows. So in that quote, Christ is saying, look, even the providence of God, the governance of God over the world, his special not just foreknowledge, but overall knowledge of all acts, past, present, and future, and his willing of those acts is such that even a tiny little bird has a part in God's plan. The death of a tiny little bird is all part of God's plan. He's in control of it. There's a special providence in the fall of the sparrow. So Hamlet is taking these two options, right, to try to figure out what the future holds through augury and saying we defy that. And he's embracing rather the kind of Christian worldview that trusts the good governance of all things to the providence of God, right? Don't delay at all this coming action, which will likely inevitably lead to death, because I will take action. I defy augury. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. I think he's talking about death here, right? uh, the This is the line. Okay. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man of aught he leaves knows, what is't to leave betimes? Let be. Okay. Again, we've got this Renaissance language, but Shakespeare says these things in ways that we can't often put into words. This line, "the readiness is all," is the conclusion, though, that whenever death comes, whenever the moment of necessary action comes that entails a kind of risk of death, no one knows. In your life, in mine, in every person's life. But nevertheless, that moment will come, the moment of challenge, the moment of necessary action, or the moment of death, or both. And the readiness for that moment is all that matters. Since no man of aught he leaves knows, what is to leave betimes, let be. And so that's the kind of conclusion in this play about the stance towards death. That's what Hamlet arrives at, and what the other views about death can't really, or haven't really so far encompassed. This kind of preparation for death, right? We can recall the moment where Hamlet is trying to decide whether or not he is to kill King Claudius, and sees that he's praying, though King Claudius later admits to himself in private that I'm not really praying, I'm just going through the motions, and I'm not ready. Right, that's one of the things I'm like, I can't repent because I'm still possessed of the goods that I've gotten through my sins, and I like those goods. So how can I say I repent when I've gotten the good things from the sin, and I like those good things, or I like those things as good? I think of them as good. He was not ready, but Hamlet thought him ready, and so there's a kind of a questioning of the preparation for this moment of testing, or this moment of death. Okay, what follows is the duel itself, and a couple of as the description says, they kind of go back and forth a little bit. They exchange, Hamlet forces an exchange of swords. Gertrude on page 277 has this sort of fateful decision where after the king drinks and then drops the pearl in the cup. So it's a poisoned pearl. It's a union pearl, which has a kind of another sort of layer, because Hamlet will pun off of this sort of like the union pearl and the unholy union of Claudius and Gertrude. But Gertrude, at the bottom of this page, around line 315, she lifts this cup to Hamlet's good fortune, the king knowing what's in it, and Gertrude not. Says, Gertrude do not drink. I will, my lord. I pray pardon me. She drinks, and the king aside says, it is the poisoned cup. It is too late. Right? This is, she's going to be killed. On this next page, we have this back and forth. The queen falls from the poison. Laertes then also falls because of the tipped poison sword. He says, I am justly killed with my own treachery. How does the queen? She swoons to see them bleed, but the queen says, no, no, the drink, the drink. Oh, my dear Hamlet, the drink, the drink. I am poisoned. This is some pretty powerful and evocative lines. If the actress really shows the kind of moment of realization. For those of you who watch the movie, this sort of plays out in the facial expressions of Glenn Close acting there, putting all the pieces together, realizing what Hamlet has said, what Claudius has said, what has happened to her late husband, and kind of seeing how this plot to poison Hamlet reveals to her the fact that her now husband poisoned her previous husband. It's this whole moment of realization, one in which a student from one of our sections really wished she had heard this line, this "I am poison" line in the movie. Uh, very important on the stage. In the movie is expressed through the kind of visual shock of the face, but without the close up, you kind of need that stage line, "I am poisoned." Uh, Hamlet, then realizing all that's happened, turns his vitriol on the king, and then with the poison tip of the sword hurts the king, and then just to add insult to injury, also forces the king to drink the poison. "Here, thou incestuous, murderous, damned Dane, drink off this poison. Is thy union here?" The union pearl, and the union of he and his mother. Let's look, however, on the sort of last lines of Hamlet, because Hamlet has also been slightly wounded with the poison-tipped sword, and so no physic can cure him. Hamlet says, "Oh, I die, Horatio." Hold on, let's see. This is where I want to start. No. So I want to point out, actually, on page 281, the first thing, the first time Hamlet says this, um, "Heaven make thee free of it, I follow thee, I am dead, Horatio. Wretched queen, adieu. You that look pale and tremble at this chance, that are but mutes or audiences to this act, had I but time, as this fell surgeon Death is strict in his arrest, oh, I could tell you. But let it be, Horatio, I am dead. Thou livest. Report me, and cause my right to be unsatisfied." So, a couple things. Um, had I but time, he says, all of those mutes in the audience to this act, all of these who have witnessed this, I could tell you the full story and all the story of my life, but I have not time because death is a strict sergeant arresting me. And of course, he's talking to the other characters who are on stage who are witnessing this duel, but he's also talking to the audience. He references them as audience. Um, but twice in this speech, he says, "I am dead." Um, and I do, again, think this goes back to this most important speech of "To Be or Not to Be," and how in that speech, dying, or death, rather, not dying, but death, is considered equivalent to or entailed in the decision to act. And Hamlet in this scene has finally decided to act, and so has died. Uh, He's decided to embrace the responsibility and the risks of life that are entailed in action, and is dead. Um, I think it's interesting that he says "I am dead" rather than "I am dying" or "I will die," because it's not quite dead yet. And I think it has to do with this understanding of the state of being dead, in part associated with the state of taking action, taking arms against the sea of trouble, instead of delaying in action. And so I sometimes feel like he could almost say, like, "I am alive, Horatio," and the effect of the line would kind of be the same, that it's not so much he's lamenting his coming demise when he says, "I am dead, Horatio, Horatio, I am dead," but it seems to me that what he's trying to express is this, I have done it, I have taken action, and in so taking action, uh, I die. And so "I am alive, Horatio, Horatio, I am alive" is another kind of way to read that, only because of the association between death and really living that Hamlet has set up in his way of thinking. Okay. Everyone does, in fact, die, or not everyone, everyone. Horatio is still alive on page 285. And then Fortinbras and the ambassador arrive. You can never forget about Fortinbras. Here he is. But Horatio is left to kind of, and even Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. In lines 411, the ambassador comes in and says just that: Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. For those of you who are interested in further reading, there's a very just total sidebar here. We're going to take a moment. There's a really funny and comical play from the 1960s called, I think it's from the 20th century, that's called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And it's all this kind of like back, like behind the scenes story of what these two minor characters who don't really have distinguished personalities, right? Can you tell me a difference between Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or Guildenstern and Rosencrantz? They're kind of like the same person. Whether it's like the comical back room conversations and amusing about kind of an existentialism. It's a great play. For another a tangent upon a tangent, and we'll get back to the is that you may have heard or recognized that Lion King, the Disney movie, is partially based off of or inspired by Hamlet, right? You remember who you are, Simba. Remember me, Hamlet. We've got the ghost of the father who's killed by the uncle that usurps the throne and marries the mother, is now telling the son to take action and reclaim the kind of honor due to the kingdom. Anyways, if Hamlet is, or sorry, if Lion King is based off of and inspired by Hamlet, some of you then may also be familiar with the Disney movie Lion King One and a Half, which is the story of Timon and Pumbaa in the background of every scene of The Lion King. And so Lion King is Hamlet, and Lion King One and a Half is this other play written in the 20th century called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which also has its own movie. Now I'm just giving you a bunch of recommendations that you're like, it's final season, I'm not going to do that. But let's just like let's wrap this up, and then we can talk about the final thoughts of the class. Okay, this last Horatio speech here. What does he say? Where should we have our thanks? Asks the ambassador, not from his mouth. Had it the ability of life to thank you, Hamlet never gave commandment for their death. But since, so jump upon this bloody question, you from the Polack Wars, and you from England, two people now are here arrived, give order that these bodies high on stage be placed to view. We have a kind of meta reference to the fact that these are great actors now having performed great performances. And let me speak to the yet unknowing world how these things came about. So shall you hear of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause, and in this upshot, purposes mistook, fallen on the inventors' heads. All this I can truly deliver. And Fortinbras agrees to have Hamlet buried in an honorable fashion, and that's the play. That's the end of the play. Okay, so let's think a bit about where we have been in this course. I have here in these slides the same slides from the intro to the medieval and the intro to the Renaissance class about our four major themes on judgment, government, art, and virtue. And so I'm going to read through those questions. And I hope now, having read Dante and Shakespeare, you can think more sophisticatedly about these questions as they pertain to medieval and Renaissance culture. Okay, so it was a large undertaking that we've set upon for this class, but I think you are better equipped now to consider these serious themes of judgment. What is justice and how is it enacted? What is salvation and how is it obtained? What is truth and how is it recognized? Things that both Dante the Pilgrim and the characters in Shakespeare, Bolingbroke, Richard II, Hamlet are very much concerned with. In different ways, but certainly they approach these large questions about judgment, final judgment, seriously. With regard to government, what is the role and value of political parties and patriotism? What is the difference between power and authority? What is the proper rule of law and how is it maintained? Here, especially in Richard II, as well as in Dante's discussion of the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, and the Pope and the Emperor, we see many medieval and Renaissance appreciations of good governance and the issues around government. With regard to art, we've asked, how does poetry educate and edify? How does music inspire and create? How does performance reveal the truth? Well, certainly all of what we've read is essentially poetry, since Shakespeare's plays are written often in a kind of meter, um, though at times when characters are speaking less formally or a descendant into madness, they use prose. There's a poetry to things that we've read. We didn't talk about Ophelia's songs, but there are sort of mad music in Hamlet, as well as divine music in Purgatorio. And how does performance reveal the truth? We talked a lot about performance with regard to Shakespeare's plays, of course, because they are performances, and the characters within them are performing, not just the actors performing the characters, but the characters performing their roles, whether Richard II performing the role of the king or Henry Bolingbroke performing the role of the non-usurping cousin. Performance reveals the truth in the Mousetrap play, as well as good acting, which holds a mirror up to nature, then shows people their own foibles and their own guilt in this case, and confirms the testimony of the ghost for Hamlet. With regard to virtue, since this was the slide for the Middle Ages, they're pretty straightforward, standard questions here, kind of a systematic, scholastic approach here. What are the four cardinal virtues and how are they cultivated? Justice, prudence, temperance, fortitude. What are the three theological virtues and how are they manifested? Faith, hope, and love. What are the seven deadly sins and how are they to be avoided? Lust, gluttony, sloth, avarice, wrath, pride, and envy. And how does will and desire relate to the growth in virtue? These are very much medieval philosophical and theological understandings of the reason and the passions, and how, though opposed to each other, one is not good and one is not bad, but rather both have their role to play, according to Dante, in the bringing of the human person into the good, true, and beautiful in the divine. When we get to the Renaissance, these slides about judgment, government, art, and virtue change a little bit. Where I said about judgment in the Renaissance, there's a crisis and a reinterpretation of justice, salvation, truth. What do these terms mean, and how and who determines their meaning, right? Whether it's that sort of corporate, public, established, stable truth of medieval orthodoxy, or if it's the more private, individual, for that reason, unstable but personal interpretation of truth that you see more in the Renaissance understandings of Christianity, with the kind of direct access to, and not just direct access to, because the Bible was relatively widely read, as far as anything was widely read in the Middle Ages, but the kind of hermeneutic that says, well, it's my interpretation, my private interpretation with God alone that understands the truth. That's a kind of crisis and a reinterpretation of these big matters about justice, salvation, and truth. With regard to government, especially through the reading of Richard II, we considered how in the Renaissance there's a crisis and reinterpretation of power and authority, conflict between individual conscience and established authority or usurped power. Certainly, throughout the Middle Ages, poor governance caused people like Dante to criticize those in authority and criticize the means in which they established their power and authority. But in the Renaissance, you have not just a criticism of the misuse of authority, but the criticism and reevaluation of authority in general. And the sort of claims to authority are being upended by new interpretations about both governmental and spiritual authority. With regard to art, in the Renaissance, there was a rebirth of art, music, performance as a means of responding to the crises of the time. How do new forms of art and influence culture? Certainly, the new ways of theater that we thought about with Hamlet, and the difference between his realism and the mousetrap play, suggest how art can hold this mirror up to nature. It's not just about providing ideals or examples of well, Dante also has a kind of realism in the psychological profiles of those in hell and purgatory, that they display that kind of persuasive, at times amiable, but nevertheless recalcitrant and unrepentant attitude, that kind of like and Dante's own empathy with them at first. It's all very, psychologically real, but in terms of performance and theater, and some of the visual arts, and music even, there's definitely changes between the medieval to the Renaissance that affect the interpretation of culture. And finally, with regard to virtue, in the Renaissance, there is a reinterpretation of medieval virtues under humanism and Protestantism. Sometimes they are reaffirmed, enhanced, other times they are abandoned and transformed. This humanism that looks not only to the afterlife, or not primarily on the afterlife, I should say, but rather looks primarily on the here and now and the potential of the human person in their lived experiences. And Protestantism, which we've spoken a lot about, but this new form of Christian practice that focuses much on the personal and the private authority of the individual to understand God through his own interpretation of Scripture. And so I think that you are now far better equipped to consider the importance of and the impact of the cultures of the medieval and Renaissance, now that we've been guided through parts of either of those cultures by two of the greatest masters from those cultures, Dante Alighieri and William Shakespeare. With Dante, we really had a synthesis of philosophy and theology in his cathedral-like construction of the Divine Comedy. That was the image we kind of went for at the beginning, was this medieval cathedral, this elaborate, awe-inspiring structure, with so many different purposes and so many different uses, but with the ultimate aim of glorifying God. And so in Dante, the medieval really explored the human condition with a Catholic lens. You had real characters and real emotions, personal characters in Dante's life, as well as these mythic historical biblical characters. Um, it wasn't a lecture. Um, Despite having this cathedral-like structure, it wasn't a dry lecture, straightforward, mandating of uh, certain ideas, but rather Dante presents us with a journey, and a journey through hell and purgatory into heaven, um, that is complicated, having all of these dialogues, conversations, even setbacks at time, but a journey with a definite end and purpose. And I think that's one way to view the medieval, is that despite all the complications and difficulties in the medieval culture, all the complexities nevertheless had a shared, definitive sense of truth and purpose. Um, with the Orthodox Catholic worldview in the Middle Ages. Um, Whereas with Shakespeare, um, we don't get a synthesis of philosophy and theology putting together a sort of cathedral-like structure. Rather, we get a dramatization of psychology and social dynamics, right? We're looking at the human condition not with a specific religious lens like the Catholic lens of Dante, but we're looking at the human condition as it relates to power and authority, identity, questions over the truth about life and death. And for that reason, it also wasn't a lecture. It wasn't a set of dry beliefs to be recited and memorized, but it was a play. It was a conversation. It was dramatic. It was entertainment, actually, and different from Dante. It was all that, an exploration of the human condition, but without a definitive end. Shakespeare's plays are great works of literature precisely because they often don't give you straightforward answers. They are great because the questions that they raise and the possible solutions, the possible responses, the many various reactions and conversations around those questions. But they're great plays because they engage us in the answering of those questions. And that's different than what Dante was doing, right? Dante was presenting you via a journey, via a complicated personal meditation, presenting you answers to life's questions. Shakespeare is presenting you with questions to life's complexities. And this, again, is another way to sort of think of the Renaissance in general. We have all this reinterpretation through private contemplation, new meanings and new media to explore it. If the image of the medieval that we want to consider is this cathedral, I think the image of the Renaissance that we can consider is this theater, this globe theater, which is Shakespeare's theater company's personal theater that they built and performed their plays out of, here depicted in the kind of cross section, because it's sort of in the round circle here with the stage in the center and the different terraces of seating, as well as the standing room only sections. But looking from the inside here, we can consider how this theater is an image of the Renaissance, where interpretation is the name of the game, and this participation in discovering and making for yourselves the possible responses to life's big questions is what it's about. So to wrap up the course here, in a way, we are all still living in the legacy of the medieval and the Renaissance periods. I think that there's a sort of profound need to explore these periods and the literature, the great works of art and culture that have been produced in them. And I think you are more well equipped to do that. This is we've looked at Dante and Shakespeare, but they're not the end all be all of either the medieval or the Renaissance. So I hope you'll recognize from this class that there's more to read, there's more to consider, there's more to discuss, right? With Dante, there's of course Paradiso, we didn't even get into that. But having read Inferno and Purgatorio enough, you are equipped to consider these deeper thoughts of paradise and the afterlife that Dante portrays it in Paradiso. And with Shakespeare, we read two of his plays. He's got a lot more plays. And so I hope that you're a little bit more well equipped to sort of jump into Shakespeare, maybe watch a movie version of it, and then read or listen to an audiobook version of more of his plays, and really consider these questions that and these complications, these psychological profiles and interactions that he's engaging with, because these two men have, for good reason, been preserved as the intellectual legacy of the Western cultural tradition. And here we are in cultural foundations too, in medieval and Renaissance. I think the reason you're meant to take this class is because in any way that you participate in your own life or in your own work and your own production of culture, any way you participate in life, in culture, I think you always should be, and I think we always are, learning from the past in order to forge that future. And so looking back on the great writers of the past has a real salutary effect on your soul, on your life, on your experience, on your enjoyment of life and experience. And so I hope that you have enjoyed. I certainly have. I hope you've enjoyed considering Dante and Shakespeare. It really has been a privilege this summer to read these books with all of you. And as we go into this last week of this course, we'll have the review for the final. And so we'll be talking more about that. The materials will be on Moodle. I should have put a little period there, actually, sort of dramatically, like, right, okay, let me back up. And I think we're always learning from the past to forge the future. Now I can say, okay, all right. Next week, we're going to be doing our review for the final and the actual final, but you should have on Moodle the final review sheet so you can prepare for the things that you're going to be considering for the final exam. It's going to be a lot of identification of the plots of these plays. I really want you to know the summaries of them and to be able to be familiar with the stories and the characters and their significances. So that should all be up for you on Moodle. Hopefully that's available. And I will look forward to seeing you in person next Tuesday for the final next Thursday. All right. Thank you.